The man who would spend the better part of a decade searching for a woman he had never met received her name like a benediction from the cracked and bleeding lips of a dying soldier in the mud of a Civil War battlefield. And from that moment forward, the name Julia Sawyer became both his compass and his cross to bear. It was the autumn of 1864, and the Battle of Cedar Creek had torn through the Shenandoah Valley like a fever dream, leaving the low hills of Virginia scattered with men who had been whole that morning, and were now broken into pieces that the earth would have to reckon with for generations. Tobias Whitaker was 22 years old, a Union cavalry scout from the hill country of Tennessee who had signed on not out of burning conviction, but out of the particular restlessness that grips young men who have seen nothing beyond their county line. He had survived 3 years of war by being quiet, careful, and faster on a horse than almost anyone alive. He had learned that survival in war was less about courage and more about paying attention. And so, when the battle turned, and the Confederate push scattered his unit across a creek bed choked with fallen men, Tobias paid attention. He found Samuel Sawyer in a shallow ditch behind a split-rail fence, half buried under another man who had fallen across him. Samuel was 40 years old and looked 60, with gray threaded through a brown beard and eyes that had already begun the long retreat from this world. He had been shot through the abdomen, the worst kind of wound, the kind that promised nothing quick and nothing kind. Tobias dragged the dead weight off him, checked him over with practiced hands, and knew before Samuel spoke a single word that there was nothing to be done except to stay. "Don't need a doctor," Samuel said, and his voice was remarkably steady for a man bleeding into the October mud. "I know what I've got." "I know it too," Tobias said honestly, and he sat down in the mud beside him because there was nothing else to do, and because it seemed wrong to let a man die alone with no one looking him in the face. Samuel Sawyer asked him his name, and Tobias told him, and then Samuel was quiet for a long while, listening to the diminishing sound of gunfire rolling away to the south. The afternoon light was thin and gray, and somewhere in a distant tree line a crow was calling, which Tobias thought was a particularly unfair detail for a man's last afternoon on earth. "I have a daughter," Samuel said finally. "Her name is Julia Sawyer. She's 19 years old and she's in Abilene, Kansas, or she was last I heard, staying with my sister Marin and Marin's husband, a man named Ford. I've been gone 3 years and I haven't written in 8 months." He stopped talking and breathed carefully, the way a man breathes when breathing itself has become a negotiation. She'll need to know I didn't just disappear." "I'll find her," Tobias said, and he meant it in the way a man means things when the gravity of a moment removes any possibility of saying anything less than the absolute truth. Samuel looked at him for a long time, assessing him with whatever clarity he had left. "You look like an honest man," he said. "I try to be," Tobias said. "Julia Sawyer," Samuel repeated, as if pressing the name into Tobias like a brand. "Abilene, Kansas, staying with Marin Ford." "I've got it," Tobias said. "I'll find her." Samuel Sawyer died 11 minutes later with his hand in Tobias's hand and the crow still calling in the tree line, and Tobias sat there in the mud holding the hand of a man he had known for less than an hour and felt the weight of a promise settle over him like a second skin. He buried Samuel the next morning, wrapped in a cavalry blanket, marked with a cross made from 2 fence rails. He wrote the name and date on a scrap of paper and tucked it into his coat. He carried it through the rest of the war, through the surrenders and the slow unraveling, through the long ride home to Tennessee where there was nothing left for him. The farm sold and his mother remarried and moved to Missouri. He carried the name Julia Sawyer the way a man carries a splinter that has worked itself too deep to remove. He spent 4 years looking for her. The first year was the hardest, not because the trail was cold, but because the West was so enormous and so indifferent to a single man's purpose. He rode west in the spring of 1865 with $60, a serviceable bay horse named Bishop, a repeating rifle, and the specific information that Julia Sawyer had last been in Abilene, Kansas, with a woman named Maren Ford and her husband. That information turned out to be worth considerably less than it had sounded in a muddy Virginia ditch. When Tobias arrived in Abilene in the late summer of 1865, the town was still finding its feet, dusty and sparse, and full of men with the particular hollow look of people who had survived the war, and were not yet sure what to do with that survival. He found a Ford family easily enough, a dry goods merchant named Edmund Ford who had a wife named Maren, a gray-haired woman with quick eyes and a manner that suggested she had been fending off disappointment for so long it had ceased to surprise her. She remembered Samuel's daughter, yes. Julia had stayed with them for 2 years. She left, Maren Ford told him, sitting across a rough table in the back of the store with her hands folded and her expression careful. About a year after the war ended, when it became clear that Samuel wasn't coming back, she got word through the army that he was listed as killed at Cedar Creek in '64, and she grieved, and then she decided to move on. Where did she go? Tobias asked. Maren looked at him with the measured suspicion of a woman who has watched too many rough men pass through a rough town. Why are you looking for her? He told her the truth. He told her about the ditch behind the fence rail, about Samuel's hands and Samuel's voice and the promise he had made. He watched something shift in Maren Ford's face, something that had been braced against him softened by degrees. She went to Dodge City, Maren said. She had met a woman there, a school teacher named Harriet Bowl, who said there was work. Julia is good with her hands, good at books, good at most things she puts her mind to. She paused. She takes after her father in that way. She deserved better than what she got. Tobias thanked her and rode to Dodge City. Dodge City in 1865 was not yet the famous cattle town it would become, but it was already a crossroads, already accumulating the particular energy of a place where too many things were happening too fast for anyone to keep proper track. He spent 3 weeks there, asking about Julia Sawyer in the careful, non-threatening manner he had learned was necessary when asking about a lone woman in a frontier town. He found the school where Harriet Bowl taught, and Harriet Bowl remembered Julia well, with something like genuine fondness. She was only here about 6 months, Harriet told him. She was a small, precise woman in her 30s who looked at Tobias as if she were calculating him. She was helping me with the younger children, very patient, very good. But she got word that there was work in Wichita, good-paying work, keeping accounts for a merchant. Julia has a head for numbers, so she went. Wichita. He rode to Wichita. In Wichita, the merchant whose accounts Julia Sawyer had kept told him she had left 8 months prior, gone south toward Indian Territory, he thought, though he was not entirely certain. He seemed annoyed by her departure, which made Tobias dislike him on sight. He pushed south and spent 3 months in the northern reaches of Indian Territory, asking in trading posts and at way stations and in small settlements that clung to the edges of the plains like afterthoughts. He asked in towns that had 3 buildings and a saloon and a population that changed every week. He found references to her, scattered and faint, like tracks in wind-dried soil. A woman matching her description had passed through. A woman named Julia had bought supplies at a trading post near the Cimarron. A woman with brown hair and clear eyes who was good with numbers had helped a family in distress. He spent the better part of 3 years following these traces, and they kept leading him west and south, deeper into the heart of a country that was enormous and beautiful and completely unconcerned with his private errand. He worked as he went, doing what he knew, scouting for cavalry patrols when there was work, wrangling horses when there wasn't, occasionally riding shotgun on supply wagons. He was good at all of it. He was particularly good at being quiet and watchful, which were the skills that kept a man alive and employed in the post-war West. He learned the land. He learned the way the sky in Kansas could turn from blue to green to black in 40 minutes and produce a storm that could kill a horse. He learned the particular loneliness of the high plains, A loneliness that was physical as well as spiritual. A loneliness you could feel pressing against you like a hand. He slept under stars that seemed closer than they had any right to be, and woke in the cold, gray dawns with the name Julia Sawyer already sitting in the front of his mind, patient and persistent, the way a promise sits. He kept a journal during those years, not because he was a literary man, but because he had found that writing things down helped him think, and thinking clearly was the only edge he had. The journal was a battered leather-bound book he had bought in Abilene, and it was filling up with entries about roads taken and roads abandoned, towns and their populations, the weather, the price of horses, and always, always, the traces of the woman he was looking for. He did not write about feelings much. He wrote about facts, but occasionally, late at night with the fire burning low, he would write something like, "I wonder what she is like, this woman whose name I carry. I wonder if she is anything like him. He was a good man. I have not met many good men." The breakthrough came in the spring of 1869, 4 years after the war's end, in a small and struggling town called Redemption, Texas, which sat in the hill country west of San Antonio with the particular stubborn determination of a place that had decided to exist despite every reasonable argument against it. Tobias rode into Redemption on a Tuesday afternoon in April, with Bishop showing his age, and the journal nearly full, and Tobias himself, 32 years old, and considerably more worn than the young cavalry scout who had sat in a Virginia ditch 5 years prior. He stopped at the town's single general store because he needed flour and salt and news, and the woman behind the counter was a broad, cheerful Mexican woman named Rosaria who seemed to know everything about everyone within 50 miles in any direction. He described Julia Sawyer as he always did, with the details he had accumulated over 4 years of following her trail. Brown hair, clear eyes, good with numbers, likely in her mid-20s now, had been a school teacher's assistant, had kept accounts. Rosaria looked at him with eyes that went from merely curious to sharply knowing. "You mean the woman who keeps the books for the Callaway Ranch," she said. Tobias went very still. "Is she here?" "She's been here 3 years, Rosaria said. "She keeps books for old Thomas Callaway, and she teaches reading to the children on Wednesday afternoons, and she is very well thought of in this town, and if you have any bad intentions toward her, I will know about it, and so will every man in the county." "I have a message from her father," Tobias said. "Her father died in my arms at Cedar Creek in 1864, and I promised him I would find her." Rosaria regarded him for a very long moment, and then she crossed herself and said, in a voice that had gone quiet, "Holy Mother, you had better sit down." He sat down. She brought him coffee and told him about Julia Sawyer. She had come to Redemption in the spring of 1866, making her way through the general disarray of the post-war Western territories, following work and opportunity with the practical determination of a woman who had no one to depend on, and so had decided to depend entirely on herself. She had found work with Thomas Callaway, who ran a cattle ranch west of town, and was old enough and wise enough to recognize competence when he saw it regardless of whether it wore trousers or a skirt. She had been keeping his books and managing his accounts ever since, and she had also, because she was apparently constitutionally unable to see children without teaching them things, organized a twice-weekly reading lesson in the back of the general store. She lived in a small house at the edge of town, neat and self-sufficient, and she was, Rosaria told him, 24 years old now and completely capable of handling herself in most situations. But Rosaria could see this was going to be a delicate business, and so she was going to be direct. "She grieved her father very hard," Rosaria said. "She doesn't speak of him often, but it is in her always. If you are going to go to her with this, you need to go carefully." "I know," Tobias said. "I've had 4 years to think about how to do it. Have you come up with anything?" He was quiet for a moment. "Not really," he admitted. Rosaria shook her head with the resigned expression of a woman who has often dealt with well-meaning but tactically helpless men. "Go see her this evening," she said. "I will tell her you are coming. It is better if she is not surprised." He spent the afternoon in Redemption, walking its 2 streets and its handful of buildings with the slightly dazed feeling of a man who has been pursuing something for so long that actually catching it feels less like triumph and more like the sudden removal of the ground beneath his feet. He bought the flour and salt. He watered and stabled Bishop. He washed his face and hands in the livery trough and attempted to make himself look like a man who was not simultaneously exhausted from 4 years of travel and terrified of a conversation he had been preparing for just as long. At 6 o'clock in the evening, with the April sun sitting red and low over the Texas hills, he walked to the edge of town and knocked on the door of a small whitewashed house with a kitchen garden along its south wall, where early tomatoes were already making their brave start against the last of the spring cold. The woman who opened the door was not what he had expected, though he would have been hard-pressed to say what he had expected. She was 24 years old, of medium height, with brown hair pulled back from a face that was composed and self-possessed and considerably more beautiful than he had been prepared for, which struck him as ridiculous because he had not been preparing for beauty at all, only for the completion of a promise. Her eyes were very clear, a kind of gray-green that reminded him of the Shenandoah Valley in October, which was a detail that hit him somewhere in the chest with a force he did not entirely anticipate. She looked at him with the direct, assessing gaze of a woman who had learned through necessity to evaluate situations quickly and accurately, and she said, "You are the man Rosaria sent word about. You were with my father." "Yes," he said. "My name is Tobias Whitaker. I was with the Union Cavalry at Cedar Creek. I was with your father when he died." Julia Sawyer looked at him for a long moment that felt much longer than it was, and then she stepped back from the door and said, "Come in." The inside of the house was small and orderly, and told him things about her without her needing to say them. There were books, more books than you would expect in a house this size in this part of Texas, stacked on shelves that had been built with obvious care against the east wall. There was a writing desk with papers organized into neat piles. There was a rag rug on the plank floor, brightly colored. There were dried wildflowers in a clay pot on the windowsill, and the window itself was clean, which in a town where water was not exactly abundant told you something about priorities. She gestured him toward a chair and sat herself in the other one, straight-backed, hands folded in her lap, watching him with those gray-green eyes that did not flinch from looking at difficult things. "Tell me," she said simply. He told her everything. He told her about the ditch behind the fence rail, about finding Samuel, about the nature of the wound and the certainty of what it meant. He told her about the conversation, about the care and clarity with which Samuel had given him the message, about the steadiness of a good man in an impossible moment. He told her that Samuel had spoken of her with love in his voice, even when there was very little breath left to speak with. He told her about the burial, the blanket and the cross, and the date he had written down and kept these 5 years. He pulled the paper from his coat pocket, worn at the folds and soft from handling, and held it out to her. It said, "Samuel Sawyer, Cedar Creek, Virginia, October 19, 1864. She took it from him and held it in both hands and looked at it for a long time without speaking. When she finally looked up, her eyes were bright, but she had not cried, and he understood from the quality of her composure that she had done her grieving long ago, had done it thoroughly and put it in its proper place, and what she was feeling now was something different, something more like resolution, something like a long open question finally answering itself. He said, "Julia Sawyer," she said. "Abilene, Kansas." "Yes." "I went to Abilene first. Your Aunt Marin told me Dodge City. Harriet Bowl told me Wichita. Then the trail went cold and I spent about 2 years in Indian Territory and the Southern Plains before I ended up here." She was looking at him now with an expression he couldn't quite read, something between disbelief and something warmer. "You spent 4 years looking for me," she said. "I told your father I would find you." "That was a promise made to a dying man you had known for less than an hour," she said. "Most men would have considered that the kind of promise you make in a difficult moment, and then release yourself from when the difficulty has passed." "Maybe," he said. "But I'm not most men." She looked at him a while longer, and then she stood and went to the small stove in the corner and said, "Stay for supper. I have venison stew and I made bread this morning. It seems the least I can do." He stayed for supper. He stayed for 3 hours. They talked about her father first, as was right and necessary. He told her the things he remembered, the way Samuel had spoken about her with such specific pride, mentioning not just that she was his daughter but what she was good at, as if wanting to hand off an accurate picture. Julia listened and asked careful questions and told him things about her father in return, stories from her childhood, the particular character of the man, the way he had been before the war took him. She had lived with the fact of his death for 4 years, had accepted it with the resignation of a generation that had lost so many fathers and brothers and sons that grief had become a kind of weather, constant and seasonal. But knowing the particulars, hearing the last things said, having someone sit across from her who had held his hand at the end, that was different. That was something she had not known she needed until she had it. When the food was done and the plates cleared, and the fire in the stove burning low and comfortable, the conversation shifted, as conversations between two intelligent people who have been talking for a while will eventually shift, from the specific to the general. They talked about the West. They talked about the peculiar quality of life in a small Texas hill country town in the years following a war that had broken the country and left the fragments scattered across the plains. They talked about the books on her shelves. They talked about horses, because he mentioned Bishop and she said she had always loved horses and he was surprised by that, though when he thought about it he wasn't sure why. He left when the night had gotten properly dark, standing at her door with his hat in his hands, and she stood in the doorway with the warm light of her lamp behind her and said, "Thank you, Tobias Whitaker, for your 4 years of trouble. It was a kinder thing than you had any obligation to do. Your father was a good man," he said. "Good men deserve to have their last wishes kept." She nodded slowly, watching him. "Will you be moving on now that you've delivered the message?" He had not thought clearly about this, which was embarrassing given how much time he had spent on the journey leading up to it. He had been so fixed on the finding that the after had remained a kind of abstraction. He turned his hat over in his hands. "I don't have anywhere particular to be," he said honestly. She considered him with those clear eyes that seemed to find dishonesty the same way water finds its own level, smoothly and without apparent effort. "There's work here," she said. "Thomas Calloway is always looking for capable hands. He's a fair employer." "I'll look into it," he said. He looked into it the next morning and was hired before noon, because Thomas Calloway was a man who could read character the way a good tracker reads ground. And what he read in Tobias Whitaker was steadiness, competence, and the particular quality of a man who does what he says he will do and says only what he means. The Calloway Ranch was a working cattle operation, with the spring roundup just beginning and enough hands needed that one more capable man was always welcome. Tobias threw himself into the work with the genuine relief of a man who has been purposeless for too long and has found purpose again. He was good with horses and good with cattle and good at the 100 practical tasks that kept a ranch functional, and the other hands accepted him with the easy, unceremonial acceptance of men who judged by performance rather than history. He saw Julia Sawyer twice a week at first, because she came to the ranch on Mondays and Thursdays to go over the books with Thomas Calloway, and these visits occasionally coincided with the midday meal, which was taken communally in the cookhouse. She was different at the ranch than she had been in her house, more relaxed, more inclined to humor, easier in the company of people she had known for years. She traded good-natured arguments with the cook, a Mexican man named Ciro, about the correct method for seasoning dried beans. She discussed the previous week's receipts with Calloway with the focused precision of someone who genuinely liked numbers and found them interesting rather than merely useful. She sometimes stopped at the corral on her way out and watched the horses with an expression of uncomplicated pleasure. Tobias watched her when she wasn't watching him, which was most of the time but not always. He did not push. He understood that the situation required a particular delicacy, that he had arrived in her life carrying the most significant possible emotional weight, and that allowing what had been heavy between them to settle and lighten before introducing anything new was not merely courtesy but basic decency. He had made a promise to her father and kept it, and that was a separate thing, its own complete arc. Whatever might grow between the two of them, if anything did, would need to be its own thing, unattached to obligation and grief and the long, strange journey that had brought him here. He spent the spring and summer working the ranch and slowly becoming part of the fabric of redemption. He was not a talkative man, but he was a present one, and the town was small enough that presence counted for as much as personality. He helped Rosaria move supplies when she was short-handed. He repaired the fence around the schoolhouse after a runaway wagon damaged it. He sat in the evenings on the steps of the bunkhouse and read, because Julia had lent him a book, one of a series of 3, and then the next one, and the next, and somehow the lending of books had become a natural, ongoing exchange between them that felt comfortable and regular, and like the beginning of a language they were inventing. She was reading one evening, sitting on the bench outside the general store with the late summer light falling gold across the pages, when he walked past on his way from the post office, and she looked up and said without preamble, "I've been thinking about what you said about the high plains, about the loneliness being physical." He stopped. They had talked about this months ago, on an evening when she had come to the ranch, and they had ended up walking out to the eastern pasture fence to look at the sunset because there was nothing else particular to do, and it seemed like the right direction to walk. He was somewhat startled that she had been carrying the thought. "And," he said. "I think you were right," she said, "but I think it can be a useful kind of loneliness. I think it teaches you what you actually need versus what you've only been told you need." He sat down on the bench beside her, not close, just near. "What did it teach you?" She thought about it with the serious consideration she gave everything, not performing thoughtfulness but actually being thoughtful. "That I can manage," she said. "That I don't require saving. That I am capable of building a life from the materials available." She paused. "But also that company is better than solitude when the company is worth having." The way she said it was perfectly neutral, and the way she looked at him immediately afterward was not neutral at all, and he felt something that had been quietly building for months shift in a new direction with an unmistakable click. "I agree with that," he said carefully, and she smiled and went back to her book, and he sat there beside her and watched the August light deepen and felt, for the first time in years, something he could not name but that felt remarkably like being exactly where he was supposed to be. The problem, Tobias began to understand over the next months, was not the feeling itself. The feeling was perfectly clear, and it was growing with the patient inevitability of something planted in good soil during the right season. The problem was the words. He was not a man who had ever found words particularly natural. He had survived the war by being economical, by saying only what was necessary, by letting actions carry the weight that other men put on language. He was good at doing things. He was considerably less good at saying them. And Julia Sawyer, with her clear eyes and her good mind and her 4 years of independence, and her particular quality of deserving to be spoken to honestly rather than vaguely, was not a woman you approached with anything less than precision. He wanted to tell her how he felt. He tried more than once to find the words, and what he found instead was a succession of inadequate fragments that he could not bring himself to assemble in her presence because they did not seem equal to the subject. He could write in his journal, alone at night, what he felt with something approaching accuracy. He could not seem to say it out loud with her standing in front of him, looking at him with those eyes that made every approximation seem dishonest. So he kept living alongside her instead. He kept working the Callaway Ranch. He kept lending books and returning them and discussing them. He helped her move a particularly heavy piece of furniture when she rearranged her front room one Saturday, and they stood afterward in the rearranged space, eating cold cornbread and arguing amiably about whether the chair was better by the window or by the bookshelf. He rode with her to church on Sundays in the fall, not because he was particularly devout, but because the road there passed through a stretch of cedar hills that was particularly beautiful in the autumn, and she had mentioned this, and he had wanted to see it. And then going together had become a habit that neither of them had formally decided to establish. He was aware that other men in town and on the surrounding ranches had noticed Julia Sawyer, and that at least two of them had made fairly direct expressions of interest that she had declined with characteristic directness and minimal drama. He was also aware that this did not necessarily mean anything particular regarding himself, and he tried to be honest with himself about this, and mostly succeeded and sometimes failed. The second autumn was when things shifted properly. It was November of 1869, the hill country going red and amber in the cool evenings, and they had taken to walking sometimes after supper when she was in town, and he had no particular reason to be back at the ranch before dark. They walked the 2 streets of Redemption and occasionally out along the wagon road that led west, where the hills opened up and the sky became enormous, and the stars, when they appeared, were the same stars he had watched from the plains for 4 years, except that they looked different from here. Brighter, maybe, or he was simply looking at them differently. On one such evening in late November, with the air cold enough to see their breath and the stars coming out one by one above the western hills, Julia stopped walking and said, without looking at him, "Tobias, can I ask you something direct?" "Always," he said. "Why are you still here?" He knew what she was asking. She was asking not about the ranch or the town, but about him specifically, about the underlying decision, about what he was doing and what he intended, and whether she was reading the situation accurately or whether she was making an error of interpretation that would be embarrassing to have made. She was asking because she was Julia Sawyer, and Julia Sawyer was not a woman who waited for clarity to come to her when she could simply ask for it. He looked at the stars for a moment, gathering himself. "Because this is where I want to be," he said. "That could mean a number of things," she said, and her voice was carefully even. "I know," he said. "I mean the most specific version of it." She turned to look at him, and in the cold November starlight her face was serious and open. "I have been wondering," she said, "for some months now, whether you were going to say anything or whether I was going to have to say it myself." "I've been trying to find the words," he said. "I haven't been finding them quickly." "You've had considerable time," she noted, and there was a very slight edge of humor beneath it. "I know, I'm sorry." She looked at him for a moment, and then she said, quietly and very directly, "I think about you more than is reasonable for someone who is merely a person of my acquaintance. I think you are the most genuinely good man I have encountered in a life that has contained a surprising number of men who were only pretending to be good. And I am telling you this because it seems unfair for only one of us to be carrying it." He stood in the cold starlight and felt the accumulated weight of 4 years of travel and another year of carefully maintained distance lift from somewhere it had been pressing and simply go. He reached for her hand, slowly enough that she could choose not to allow it, and she allowed it, and her hand was warm in the cold air. "I have been trying to find words adequate to the situation," he said, "and I think the problem is that there aren't any exactly. So I'm going to say the most accurate version I have." He took a breath. "I came here carrying your name like a promise, and I found you, and you were so entirely beyond what I had imagined, so entirely yourself, that I have spent the past 8 months feeling like a man who walked into a room looking for one thing and found something so much larger that he didn't know how to speak about it." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "That is a good version. I'm glad. It took you 8 months. I told you I was slow with words." She laughed, a real laugh surprised out of her, and it was a good sound, warm and genuine in the cold air. Her fingers pressed against his. "You'd better not be slow about everything," she said. "I'm not," he said. "I promise." That winter was one of the finest seasons of Tobias Whitaker's life, which was a thing he would have found frankly astonishing if the 22-year-old version of himself sitting in a Virginia ditch could have seen it. The hill country of Texas in winter was cold and clear, with frosts that silvered the cedar groves and creek beds that ran high with winter rain and skies that seemed scrubbed clean and enormous. He and Julia moved through the season with the careful, joyful attention of two people who have waited long enough for something that they are in no hurry to rush it now that they have it. He came to town on evenings that were not required by work, and they ate supper together in her kitchen, which was small and warm and smelled of whatever she was cooking, and the dried herbs she kept in bundles along the wall above the window. She cooked the way she did everything, with focus and without waste, and the food was always good. He washed the dishes because it seemed right, and she let him because she had enough self-possession not to refuse help out of pride. They talked about everything. They talked about the war, carefully and seriously, the way survivors of large and terrible things talk about them when they trust each other enough to be honest. She had lost her father to it, and he had lost years of his life and a certainty about the world that had not fully returned. And they sat with these losses between them, not as wounds that needed managing, but as true things about themselves that deserved to be acknowledged and shared. He talked about his years on the plains, about what they had been like, and she listened with the quality of attention he had noticed in her from the first evening, a listening that was active and generous, and made the speaker want to be more honest than they usually were. He told her about the journal, about the entries he had written on cold nights in Indian Territory wondering about her, and she looked at him with an expression of such particular tenderness that he had to look away for a moment. "Can I read it?" she asked. "Someday," he said. She looked at him and seemed to decide that this was an acceptable answer. "Someday," she agreed. In January, Thomas Calloway called Tobias into the ranch house study, a room full of worn leather furniture and the particular smell of old paper, and offered him the position of ranch foreman. The previous foreman had taken a job in New Mexico, and Calloway said he had been watching Tobias for 8 months and had not seen a single thing that gave him pause. The pay was better and the responsibility was considerable, and it meant a more permanent kind of presence in redemption than a hired hand's position did. Tobias accepted it. He told Julia over supper that evening, and she looked at him across the table with a smile that took its time arriving, but once it was there was absolutely genuine. "Calloway doesn't give that position to anyone he's not certain of," she said. "He gave the previous man a 4-year tryout before he offered it. He told me." "He trusted you in 8 months," she said. "That's an opinion worth having." "I thought so too," he said. And then, because the foreman's house came with the position, a small but solid 3-room structure on the eastern edge of the ranch property, and because this seemed both practical and important to acknowledge, he said, "I'll be moving out of the bunkhouse. There's a proper house." She looked at her plate for a moment and then looked up at him. "A proper house," she repeated, in a tone that could not quite conceal a thought she wasn't going to say out loud just yet. "It needs some work," he said. "I expect I could help with that," she said, "if you wanted the help." "I would very much want the help," he said. The house was indeed in need of work, and the work of putting it right became a project they shared through January and February, the cold months of the hill country winter, patching the roof and rehanking the door and replastering the wall in the bedroom where rain had worked its way through a gap. They worked together on Saturdays and sometimes on Sunday afternoons, and Tobias discovered that Julia Sawyer was entirely competent with a hammer and considerably more patient than he was with plastering, which required a particular tolerance for things going wrong multiple times before going right. He discovered that she hummed while she worked, not a recognizable tune but a kind of running melodic commentary on whatever she was doing, and that she made strong coffee and brought it in a tin pot and left it on the windowsill where the weak winter sun could keep it warm. He discovered that he loved her completely and without any ambivalence, which was both a startling and entirely natural discovery to make, and he sat with it for about 2 weeks before he understood what it required of him. He proposed to her in March, on a Sunday afternoon with the first real warmth of approaching spring in the air, and the cedar groves releasing their sharp, clean scent on the south wind. They were sitting on the low stone wall of the ranch house's eastern pasture, having ridden out to check on some cattle that Calloway was worried about, and the cattle were fine, and the afternoon was fine, and everything felt very right and uncomplicated. He had thought about the words more this time. He had been thinking about them for 2 weeks. He turned to her on the stone wall with the wide Texas sky behind her and said, "I came here 4 years ago to keep a promise to a dying man, and I found something I hadn't known I was looking for, and I have spent the better part of a year being careful not to move too fast, and I think I've been careful long enough." He paused. "Julia Sawyer, I would like to spend the rest of my life in your company, and I would like to ask whether you would be willing to marry me." She looked at him with those gray-green eyes in the March afternoon light, and the wind moved through her hair, and she was so herself, so entirely and particularly herself, that he felt the simple wonder of her existence hit him freshly, as it did with regularity and showed no sign of stopping. "Yes," she said. "I was beginning to think I would have to ask you myself." "I was getting there," he said. "Another 4 years," she asked, and her eyes were full of that warmth she had learned to stop containing. "No," he said, "I've gotten faster." She laughed, and then she put her hand against his face and kissed him, there on the stone wall with the spring wind in the cedars, and the cattle moving peacefully in the middle distance, and the entire unbounded Texas sky above them. And it was a very long and very satisfactory kiss, that resolved itself eventually into the two of them sitting on the wall with their shoulders against each other, watching the afternoon light move across the hills. They were married in May of 1870, in the small white church in Redemption, which held all 43 residents of the town and a number of surrounding ranch families who had come because Thomas Calloway was there, and because Rosaria had told everyone within 30 miles, which was effectively the same thing as a formal invitation. The day was clear and warm, and the wild flowers were out in the hills, bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush making a riot of color on the slopes above the road. Rosaria cried, which she did loudly and without embarrassment, and Thomas Calloway, who was in his late 60s and had buried a wife and a son, and had every reason to find other people's happiness a comfortable thing, sat in the front pew with an expression of straightforward satisfaction. Cyril the cook, who had somehow become involved in providing the wedding supper despite this being somewhat outside his professional scope, had been in the church kitchen since 4 in the morning, and the smell of what was happening in there was making the ceremony compete for the congregation's full attention. Julia wore a dress she had made herself, pale blue cotton with white at the collar and cuffs, and she had braided her brown hair and wound it up, and she was the most beautiful thing Tobias had seen in 33 years of looking at the world, and he told her this standing before the minister, quietly enough that only she could hear, and she pressed her lips together in a way that meant she was preventing a smile from being ungovernable, and said, just as quietly, "You're not so bad yourself, Tobias Whitaker." The minister, a patient man named Reverend Ames who had heard stranger things said during ceremonies, waited a beat and then continued. They stood together at the reception in the evening with the hills going orange in the last light, accepting congratulations from their neighbors and eating Cyril's cooking, which was as good as the smell had promised. And Tobias had the specific, settled feeling of a man whose life has arrived somewhere after a long journey, and who recognizes the destination with the particular gratitude of someone who was not entirely sure he would find it. That summer they settled into the life of the foreman's house, which was now properly their home, with Julia's books filling the shelves Tobias built along the study wall and her kitchen garden extending from the south side, and her dried flowers on the windowsill. She continued her work for Thomas Calloway, keeping the ranch books with the same focused precision she had always brought to it. And she started a proper school in Redemption in the fall, because 3 families had come to her separately and said their children needed teaching, and she was clearly the right person to do it. And she was not a woman who said no to a clear need when she was capable of meeting it. Tobias managed the ranch with the competence and steady temperament that had made Calloway certain about him, and he was good at it in the particular way of a man who finds genuine satisfaction in solving practical problems, in keeping things functioning, in the honest and necessary work of managing land and animals and people. The Calloway ranch prospered. They had been married a year when Tobias brought out the journal. It was a quiet evening in late May of 1871, with the anniversary of their wedding just past, and they were sitting by the window in the last daylight, and he said, "I think it's time," and went to the chest at the foot of the bed where he kept it and brought it to her. She held it in both hands, this battered leather book, looking at the cover for a moment, and then she opened it and began to read. He watched her read. He read his own book in her face, in the small expressions that moved through it. The careful composure she brought to the early entries about finding Samuel, the ones written from the Virginia mud and the Tennessee hills, the slight stiffening around her eyes at the pages about Abilene and the Fords and Marin's account of Julia's departure, the thing that moved across her face when she reached the entries from Indian Territory, the ones that included the line, "I wonder what she is like, this woman whose name I carry." She read for a long time. She was a fast reader, but she was going slowly with this, and he let her, adding wood to the fire and brewing coffee and sitting in the other chair, and waiting with the patience he had spent 4 years developing. When she finally closed the book, it was fully dark outside and the lamp was lit, and the coffee had been made and drunk, and she had been crying without seeming to notice it, the way people sometimes cry when the sadness and the gratitude come together. She held the book against her chest for a moment, and then she said, "You wrote about him very kindly, my father." "He deserved it," Tobias said. "You wrote in April of '67 that you were beginning to think you might never find me, that the West was too large and too indifferent, and perhaps you should accept that you had done what you could. I remember writing that. But you kept going." "Of course I did," he said, as if there had never been any other option, and maybe for him there hadn't. She put the journal on the table between them very carefully, as if it were something fragile, which in a sense it was. "I want you to know," she said, "that I understand the full weight of what you did. Not just finding me, though that alone was an extraordinary thing, but the way you arrived here and the care you took and the patience you had. My father gave you my name and you carried it for 4 years like it was worth something, like I was worth something." She stopped for a moment. "I spent 4 years on my own in this country, and I found out I was capable, and that was a necessary and not unhappy thing to discover. But I also found out that it is different being cared for, being considered, being worth someone's effort." "You are worth considerably more effort than I gave," he said honestly. She shook her head, dismissing the self-deprecation. "You are a good man, Tobias Whitaker," she said. "You were a good man to my father for 11 minutes in a ditch in Virginia, and you have been a good man to me for 2 years, and I think you will be a good man for as long as there is any of you left to be, and I want you to know that I see it. I see all of it." He got up from his chair and crossed to hers and crouched down in front of her and took her face in his hands with the gentleness that things deserving of care require, and said, "I love you, Julia Whitaker." She had been Julia Whitaker for a year, and he had not said it quite like that before, with the weight fully in it. And she pressed her forehead against his and closed her eyes and said, "I love you, Tobias. Lord, I love you so much." They stayed like that for a long moment with the lamp burning and the night outside and the journal on the table between them, all those years of searching contained in its worn pages, and the house was warm and theirs, and the world outside was the wide Texas night full of stars. By the summer of 1871, Thomas Calloway's health had begun to decline. He was in his late 60s, and the ranch life, which had been the material of his whole existence, was becoming more than his body could sustain. He had no surviving children. He had a nephew in San Antonio, a young man named Frederick Calloway who showed some interest in the property, but was ultimately more occupied with his business interests in the city. Thomas called Tobias into the study in September of that year and had the kind of direct conversation that characterizes men who have spent their lives in places that don't allow for comfortable vagueness. "I'm drawing up papers," Thomas said. "I want you to have this ranch when I'm gone, you and your wife. I've talked to my lawyer and I've talked to Frederick, who is honestly relieved because he has no more interest in running cattle than I have in running a dry goods business. Julia manages the books, you manage the land and the people. You know this place better than anyone except me, and you've cared for it like it's your own, which means something." Tobias sat across from Thomas Calloway and felt the enormity of what was being offered settle over him. He thought about 32-year-old him riding into redemption on an aging bay horse with $60 and a worn piece of paper. He thought about 22-year-old him in a Virginia ditch with the autumn light going thin. "I'm grateful," he said, "more than I can say." Thomas waved this off with the slight impatience of a man who has never been comfortable with gratitude. "You've earned it. Julia's earned it. Don't sentimentalize it." But there was warmth in his eyes that contradicted the brusque tone. Thomas Calloway passed away in the winter of 1872, quietly and at home, which was the way he had indicated he intended to go, and which he managed without any deviation from plan. He was buried on a hill at the east edge of the property he had built, where he had once told Tobias he liked the view of the morning light. The town of Redemption came to the burial, and the neighboring ranches sent representatives, and Reverend Ames said kind and accurate things, and Julia stood beside Tobias in the winter cold and felt the particular grief of losing someone who had been, without quite the formal designation, a second father. The Calloway Ranch became the Whitaker Ranch in the spring of 1872, and this transition was as natural as such transitions can be when they are properly prepared and properly inherited. The hands stayed on, because they had hired on under Tobias's management for 2 years and trusted it. The account stayed in Julia's hands and grew more complex as the ranch grew, because she was good at it, and because growth, in the Texas Hill Country of the early 1870s, was both possible and warranted. Tobias was 30 years old and Julia was 27, and they were ranchers with a proper property and a proper house and a proper life, which was a sentence that would have been incomprehensible to either of them a decade prior, and which felt, in the living of it, both extraordinary and entirely natural. Their son was born in the summer of 1872. They had known a child was coming since the early spring, and Julia had received the news with the calm practicality she brought to all significant developments, which was to say, she allowed herself one proper astonished moment, and then began making practical arrangements. She had strong feelings about the medical care available in Redemption, which was limited, and she had written to a doctor in San Antonio and secured his agreement to come when the time was near, which was an expense she considered entirely non-negotiable. The birth was in July, during a heat that made the hill country shimmer and the creek beds run low, and the doctor came as promised, a capable man who took Julia's competence and opinions seriously in the manner of a physician who had learned through experience that women knew their own bodies with an authority that superseded his theory. The labor was long but not complicated, and when it was over Julia was tired and fine and Tobias was considerably less fine than Julia, but was attempting to appear otherwise. The boy was healthy and loud, and had Julia's clear eyes and Tobias's general air of taking things in carefully before deciding what to do about them, which at 3 hours old expressed itself as a very focused look in both directions, and what appeared to be a preliminary assessment of the situation. "Samuel," Julia said, before Tobias had said anything at all. She was holding the baby against her, very still, looking at him with an expression that contained the entire complexity of loss and continuation. "If that's all right with you." He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, and at his wife, and at the late afternoon light coming through the window of the room they had plastered together in the winter of 1869, and said, "It's more than all right." Samuel Thomas Whitaker, the middle name for Thomas Calloway, was a healthy and curious child who grew into a healthy and curious boy with a remarkable gift for climbing things that were not meant to be climbed, and a genuine interest in horses that manifested at an age that was, according to Tobias, dangerously early, and according to Julia, entirely appropriate. He had the run of the ranch from the time he could walk, in the relatively supervised manner of a child whose parents have enough people around who are paying attention that the child is always within sight of someone. And he grew up understanding that the land was a working thing, and the animals were working animals, and the people who cared for them were doing something real and necessary. Rosaria, who had remained in redemption, and whose opinion on all matters was as authoritative as ever, declared Samuel a beautiful child with excellent character and reasonable manners considering what he was daily up against, which everyone understood to mean the general atmosphere of a working cattle ranch, which is not naturally conducive to the refinement of manners. The years settled into the particular rhythm of ranch life and town life and family life that is its own kind of richness, not spectacular in the way of adventures and searches and impossible promises kept, but deep in the way of things that accumulate meaning through repetition and care. Tobias and Julia had their arguments, as married people do, because they were both people with strong opinions and clear ideas about the right way to do things, and occasionally these ideas conflicted in ways that required some negotiation. Their arguments were honest and direct and resolved, generally, by the same quality of directness that had brought them together, the willingness to say the actual thing rather than circling around it. They never went to sleep genuinely angry, which was a principle they had arrived at not through any particular rule, but through the simple observation that waking up with unresolved anger was a worse way to start a day than any of the discomforts of a difficult evening conversation. Julia expanded the school in Redemption into a proper schoolhouse in 1874, when the town's population had grown enough to warrant it, and when she had recruited a second teacher, a young woman named Clara Marsh who had come from Virginia and who brought with her a particular love of literature and an excellent singing voice that improved the school's music education considerably. Redemption was growing, as the Texas Hill Country was growing in those years, filling in with families and small businesses and the general infrastructure of a community that has decided it intends to be permanent. A second store opened in 1873. A doctor came to stay permanently in 1875, which Julia received as a personal victory she had been arguing for since the year of Samuel's birth. Tobias managed the ranch through the boom years of the Texas cattle industry with the same steady competence that had marked his work from the beginning, expanding the herd carefully and maintaining the land with an eye toward keeping it productive for the next generation, which was how Thomas Calloway had always spoken of the land, and which Tobias had absorbed as the correct philosophical approach. He had 6 full-time hands by 1874, and a spring roundup that required temporary additional labor from the surrounding area. And on roundup mornings, with the hills misty and the cattle lowing and the hands moving with the purposeful efficiency of a well-run operation, Tobias sometimes stood at the edge of the corrals and felt something that had no name he knew, but that was in the vicinity of deep contentment, the particular satisfaction of a life that has found its proper shape. He still carried the piece of paper, not in his coat anymore, not pressed against him like a talisman, but in the small box at the top of the wardrobe where he kept things of significance. Samuel Sawyer, Cedar Creek, Virginia, October 19, 1864. He showed it to young Samuel when the boy was old enough to understand what it was, sitting in the study with the October light through the window, and told him the story of his maternal grandfather, the whole story from the ditch to the years of searching, and watched his son receive this information with a child's capacity for making the large things normal, which is both the most natural and the most moving thing in the world. "So you were looking for Mama," Samuel said, at 7 years old, with the direct logical processing of a child whose mother has raised him to follow arguments to their conclusions. "For 4 years," Tobias confirmed. Samuel considered this. "And then you found her. And then I found her. And then what happened? And then I needed to find the words," Tobias said. "That took another 4 years." Samuel looked at him with the kind of expression that suggested he was filing this information away for some future use he had not yet identified. "That seems like a long time," he said. "It was," Tobias agreed. "Don't make the same mistake. When you have something worth saying to someone who matters, say it directly. Your mother taught me that." Julia, from the doorway where she had been listening without anyone noticing, said, "It took him considerably longer than it should have." But she was smiling. Their daughter was born in 1875, a clear autumn morning with the hills full of color and the air sharp and clean, and she came into the world with an air of someone who had already decided she was not going to waste a moment. She had Tobias's darker coloring and Julia's quality of focused attention, and a set of opinions that announced themselves at a very early age and showed no sign of moderating. They named her Clara, not after the schoolteacher, though that was a happy coincidence, but after Julia's own mother, who had died when Julia was 12, and who lived on in Julia's memory as a woman of warmth and intelligence and considerable practical courage. Clara Sawyer had married Samuel Sawyer in the 1840s and had made a life with him in the years before the war took the shape of things away, and naming the daughter after her felt to Julia like a proper completion of a circle. Clara Whitaker grew up understanding that she had opinions equal to anyone else's in the county, and that the ranch was as much hers to understand as it was Samuel's, a position her parents held with a consistency that occasionally surprised other families in the area who operated on somewhat different assumptions. She helped with the books before she was 10, sitting beside her mother at the desk with a serious expression and a natural affinity for numbers that made Julia unspeakably pleased. She also helped with horses, which was Samuel's domain, and occasionally organized the younger children in the area into activities of her own devising, which was recognizably her mother's influence. Rosaria's store became a kind of unofficial town center over those years, a place where information and opinion circulated freely, and where Rosaria herself presided with the authority of someone who has been paying close attention for a long time. She remained Julia's closest friend, the friendship between them having been established in those first minutes of the first morning, and had a standing invitation to Sunday supper at the ranch that she accepted as reliably as the weather. Sawyer, the cook, had eventually married a woman named Alma who helped him, and between them, they had opened a small restaurant in Redemption, which was modest in its ambitions and remarkable in its results, and which quickly became the place where the Whitakers and Callaway hands and half the hill country came on Saturday evenings when the week was done, and sitting down to someone else's cooking felt like the most civilized thing available. It was at Sawyer's restaurant, on a Saturday evening in the spring of 1876, that Tobias was sitting with Julia and watching their children conduct an argument about something that seemed important to them, and Rosaria was there with her husband, a quiet man named Antonio, who had come west from San Antonio and had somehow found himself permanently attached to Redemption via Rosaria, and several of the ranch hands and their families occupied the other tables. The restaurant was lit with lamp light, and the air was warm and smelled of good food, and the general comfortable noise of a community at ease. And Tobias looked at Julia across the table, and she was talking to Rosaria about something with her head slightly tilted, and her hands making a small gesture that he knew from years of watching meant she was building toward the conclusion of an argument. and the lamplight was on her face, and she was 31 years old and entirely beautiful, and she caught him watching and gave him the look that meant she knew exactly what he was thinking and was not displeased. He had spent 4 years looking for her and another 4 finding the words, and in the years since there had been more words, better ones, words learned through the daily practice of a shared life that teaches you the particular language of another person, the words they need and the words that mean the most and the words that don't need to be said, because some things have been established so completely that saying them is like explaining water. He had come to her carrying a dead man's hope, a name and a city, and a promise made in the mud and smoke of a war he had wanted no particular part of, and she had been exactly what he had not known to hope for, which was a woman so thoroughly herself that loving her felt not like finding shelter, but like finally having a view of the horizon. He reached across the table and took her hand, interrupting the argument with Rosaria, who said in the tone of a woman who has been witnessing other people's happiness for years and has not tired of it. Julia looked at him. "I was just thinking," he said. "I know," she said, and her thumb moved against his hand. "I was thinking about Cedar Creek." She was quiet for a moment. These thoughts came to him occasionally, not with grief anymore, but with the particular quality of things that changed you so fundamentally that you can never entirely separate yourself from them. She understood this because she had her own version of it, her own October morning in 1864 that had rerouted her life irrevocably. "What were you thinking about it?" she said. "That your father did a good thing," he said, "giving me your name, trusting me with it. I've thought about whether he knew, somehow, that it was more than just a message I was delivering." "Do you think he did?" she asked. "I think he was a man who paid close attention to people," Tobias said. "I think in 10 minutes in a ditch he looked at me and made a calculation." He paused. "I think he gave me your name because he believed I would keep it properly." Julia's eyes were bright in the lamplight, not with sadness but with the full feeling of a woman who has learned that love can come through the strangest and most impossible doors, and that this does not make it any less real or any less hers. "He was a good judge of character," she said softly. "He was," Tobias said. "He was a very good man." Samuel, aged 4, tugged at his father's sleeve and said with the urgency of a child who had been waiting an appropriate amount of time for the adult conversation to pause, "Papa, Clara took my bread." Clara, aged 1, was in fact engaged in a focused investigation of a piece of cornbread from her brother's plate, and her expression conveyed no particular awareness of wrongdoing. Tobias and Julia looked at their children, and then at each other, and the solemnity of the moment became laughter, warm and immediate, the kind that fills up a room, and Rosaria joined it, and the restaurant noise continued, and the April night outside was warm and the hill country was green, and the stars above Texas were the same stars that had watched over Cedar Creek and the Virginia hills, and 4 years of riding and searching, and another 4 years of learning to say what was true. Later, when the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Julia sat at her writing desk in the soft lamplight and Tobias sat in his chair with a book he wasn't reading, and the night outside was full of the small sounds of the ranch settling into sleep, the horses in the pasture and the creek running low in the early spring, and the owl that had claimed the cedar tree at the east fence as a permanent residence. She was writing a letter to Clara Marsh at the school about the curriculum for the fall term, and her pen moved in the quick, confident way she had with all writing, but after a while she stopped and looked up and said, "Tobias." He said. "I want you to know," she said, "that I think about it sometimes too, what would have happened if you hadn't come, if you'd let the promise go the way most men would have." "I know," he said. "I had a good life here," she said. "I had made a good life. I was not unhappy." "I know that too. But," she said and stopped, and the but hung in the air between them full of everything it contained. "But," he agreed. She smiled and went back to her letter, and he went back to the book he wasn't reading, and the owl called once from the cedar tree, and the night deepened around the house that held them. In the morning, Tobias was up before the light to check on the new calf that one of the heifers had been working toward for 2 days, And Julia made coffee and cut bread and got it on the table before the children were fully awake. And Samuel came downstairs with his hair completely unsorted and his boots on the wrong feet. And Clara was carried down by her father when he came in from the barn with mud on his boots, and a report that the calf was healthy and doing well. And the four of them sat at the kitchen table in the early morning light with the coffee steam rising and the day beginning. "What day is it?" Samuel asked, because he was at the age where this information seemed important to establish at the start of every morning. "Thursday," Julia told him. "Is it a school day?" "Yes." "Is Clara coming to school?" "Clara is not yet 2 years old," Julia said patiently. "She will come to school when she's older." Samuel accepted this with the resigned tolerance of an older sibling. Clara, for her part, appeared to be concentrating on her bread, with an intensity that suggested she was already doing her own kind of learning, and did not require a formal institution to do it. Tobias drank his coffee and watched his family in the morning light and felt the full, settled weight of a life that had arrived somewhere real after the long journey of getting there. He thought of Samuel Sawyer's voice in the fading afternoon of an October day, giving him a name, giving him a direction, trusting him with a daughter he had loved and a message he needed kept. He had kept it. He had kept more than the message. He had kept everything. The years continued the way good years do, full and ordinary, and shot through with the specific brightness of a life shared with people you love. Samuel grew up and grew tall, and had the manner of a young man who thinks carefully before speaking, which his mother approved of, and his father recognized as something he had to work considerably harder to achieve. He helped run the ranch by the time he was a teenager with a capability and seriousness that made Tobias quietly proud, and made the hands treat him with the respect they'd have given a grown man, because he'd earned it. He had his grandfather's brown eyes and his father's way with horses, and his mother's absolute inability to leave a book unfinished once it had been started. Clara, as the years bore out their early indications, was a person of considerable force, organized, opinionated, warm in the specific way of someone who feels things deeply and is not embarrassed about it. She took over the school accounts from her mother at 15, with Julia's blessing and considerable competence. She had opinions about the cattle business, about the running of the town, about the proper way to manage a drought year's herd reduction that turned out to be entirely correct, which was both impressive and somewhat exasperating to the older men she explained it to. Redemption grew. The hill country filled in. The railroad came to a town 20 miles east in 1878, which changed the mathematics of the cattle business considerably, and which Tobias navigated with the steady pragmatism he brought to all changes, adjusting the operation, making the necessary investments, keeping the ranch sound through the shifts. Thomas Calloway's portrait hung in the study, painted from memory by a traveling artist in 1873, after Julia had decided it was intolerable that there was no likeness of him in the house he had built and loved and given to them. The artist had done reasonable work from Julia's descriptions, and from the recollections of several hands who had known Thomas for years, and the result was a man who looked somewhat like Thomas, and entirely like the idea of Thomas, which Julia decided was acceptable. On the anniversary of their wedding each year, Tobias and Julia rode out to the eastern pasture where the stone wall stood and sat on it in the evening light and watched the sun go down over the hills. They had done this every year since the spring of their engagement, and they continued to do it because some things are worth repeating until they become part of the structure of your life, as natural and necessary as water. On the evening of their 10th anniversary, in May of 1880, they sat on the stone wall with the hill country darkening around them and the stars coming out above the cedar groves, and Julia leaned against him, and he put his arm around her. And they were quiet together in the way that takes years to learn, and is one of the best things available to human beings, a shared silence that contains everything without needing to say any of it. He had spent 4 years looking for her name, and another 4 finding the words, and then a decade living inside the life those words had made possible, and he thought, sitting on the stone wall with the evening deepening and his wife's shoulder warm against his, that there was not a single step of the journey he would have changed. Not the ditch in Virginia, not the years in the wind and the loneliness of the plains. Not the 8 months of quiet waiting and the November night on the road when she had asked him directly what he was still doing there. Not a word. "What are you thinking about?" Julia asked. "Your father," he said. "What he would think of all this." She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "I think he would be very pleased. I think he would like you very much." "I hope so," he said. "He gave you my name," she said softly. "Out of everyone in that field he gave you my name. I think he already knew." The last light faded from the western sky, and the first stars of the Texas evening were bright and steady above them. And somewhere on the ranch their children were in the house under the light of lamps, one of them reading and one of them making noise about something. And the horses moved in the pasture below, and the creek ran, and the night came on warm and full and entirely, completely good. Tobias held Julia closer and put his face against her hair, and she settled against him with the ease of 10 years of this same motion, and he said quietly into the dark, "I'd do it again. All of it." She tilted her head back to look at him, and her face in the starlight was the face he knew better than any face in the world and loved more each year with the particular deepening that comes when love has had time and honesty and difficulty to work with, and she said, "I know you would. That's one of the things I love most about you." He kissed her, there on the stone wall under the Texas stars, and it was the same wall and the same hills and a different sky and better words than he'd had 10 years ago. And the night settled around them, warm and wide and full of everything a life had brought to this place. All the years and all the miles and all the words finally found, and the name he had carried like a compass pointing always here, always home, always her. The Whitaker Ranch stood for generations after, and the people who came later would hear the story of the man who had been given a name on a battlefield and spent 4 years finding the woman it belonged to. And they would say it was the kind of story you didn't entirely believe, and the old-timers would say that was all right, because the best ones never quite sounded like they should be true. But it was, every word of it.